A second strike in less than 20 seconds and the fly is doomed.
I mean, that's what entertainment's supposed to do. It's supposed to make you forget your miserable life, your miserable life, your miserable life.
Pero esto que me cuentas es dramático. Deberíamos ir ahora mismo a comprar una merluza.
1858. En ny uppfinning registrerar det det mänskliga ögat inte kan se. Kamerans uppgift är att bevisa fakta. Varje fotografi blir till ett autentiskt kapitel.
Sex, again, you and me.
Okay.
La primera vez que vi bailar a Antonia Singla fue en unas imágenes antiguas colgadas en internet.
It's never quite right, the way the food tastes, the way the streets smell, the way the music sounds, all the dreams we dream, all the loves we chase, all the crumbs we beg. They're never quite right, they hardly close to right. Believe me, they're never gonna be right.
Love at first sight.
Un tema de grandes contrastes, donde la auténtica genialidad mezcla la amargura con la alegría más desbordante.
Turn the camera, go ahead. Turn the camera, ma'am. Turn the camera.
No se ve nada, está todo negro.
Isso acho que é racismo institucional.
Que yo he estado con muchos hombres, pero con muchos.
No estoy tranquila, estoy preocupada.
No parece.
Me preocupa que esto haya llegado tan lejos.
Hola, bueno.
Hi. Well, I hope you've enjoyed these 2 short films. Now, very briefly, while they finish setting up the stage for the panelists, I'll be introducing each of those who will be a part of this panel. I'd like to begin by welcoming Salim Fayyad. Salim is Colombian, and he has been living for quite some time in South Africa. He is a cultural manager, co-director of MUICA, as well as correspondent for Sub-Saharan African film. We also have guests from Generation Africa, as I said earlier, Shamila Sidat. Shamila, welcome. She is a filmmaker as well as a lawyer that specializes in human rights in her previous life prior to being a documentary maker. We also have Shenge Numbira. Please come forward. She always introduces herself as Numbira Shenge. Shenge is a filmmaker from Rwanda, and she directed the first film we saw, Lend Me Your Voice, and I hope we have a chance to hear straight from her on the device she used for that short film. And Usman is also present. Usman Samaseku, a filmmaker from Mali. They're all in Colombia for the first time and very excited to be here in Cartagena. Jessica Hoyos is here as well. She is a lawyer that specializes in human rights. She is Colombian and she's part of the firm Jose Alvear Restrepo, as well as Walter. Many of you know him, and I hope there is great synergies with Merry Monday and that we get to speak of radio programs and the role that radio has in our country. Very well, thank you.
Ya, gracias. Mientras ellos terminan de sentarse.
Great. Well, while they have a seat, I'm going to tell you about who I am and why I'm here. My name is Maria Jose Roman, and I am here working with DW Academy, a German organization, a media organization, working with projects abroad. And DW Academy supports projects in various parts of Latin America, as well as Africa, Asia, and Europe. DW Academy works with partners and organizations in various countries. Here in Colombia, we are fortunate to support DACO Labs, who are organizing an impact lab during this film festival. And in South Africa, our partner is an organization that has the name STEPS, an NGO that is behind the Generation Africa project. As I said, Generation Africa is a collection of 25 documentaries from various countries in Africa. And what the common thread is that they tell stories of young people in Africa. It's a young population, that of Africa, more than 60%, and therefore its future lies in their hands. This project began by Don Edkins, the director of STEPS, in the year 2015, when in Europe there was what was called the migratory crisis. Many migrants were arriving, and he realized that a large part of the discourse and narrative was not being seen. And it's that most of the migration occurring was within the African continent, and that there are many ideas that people have on migration that are not accurate. So we're now going to begin this panel, and we'll be discussing what similarities there are and what potential there is for South-South exchanges between the South in the Americas and Africa. Thank you, Maria, and thank you all for being here. I'd just like to begin sharing very briefly a context of why we're here and why we believe these South-South dialogues are so important. beyond speaking of it and the discourse, we believe connections between Latin America and Africa are generally born with slave traffic in the Americas many centuries ago. But apart from that cultural and historic legacy that we are very conscious of when being here in Cartagena, there are many countries in the global south, especially Latin America and Africa. And here we're speaking of situations that began in inequality, corruption, but also situations in some countries that have to do with a traumatic past. We're going to speak about this throughout today's panel. But before that, I wanted to briefly make a heartfelt mention to Karim Ghanem, the editor-in-chief of El Malpensante magazine. He was going to sit and speak with us today. He was going to speak of his work on the final report of the Truth Commission in Colombia, but Karim passed away early this month, which is why he's not with us today. But we remember him. He is present in our memory. I'd also like to invite you to read his book. He published a book on culinary tales, which is an unexplored topic in Colombia, but I hope you can enjoy his fabulous prose, as well as I'd invite you to read the report on the Truth Commission. It's not something you would read for entertainment, but it's a historic document that should interest all of us in this country. Now, why South-South initiatives, and why are we here? We're going to begin with Shamila Sidad. She's from South Africa. And South Africa is a country that in 1994 was going through a period in time of transition toward democracy from the apartheid and the oppression from that period. It ended in 1990, and in 1994, in April specifically, Nelson Mandela becomes the first black president in the country, and this is when democracy's era begins in South Africa. And that same month, April 1994, Rwanda, Shenge's country, who is with us today, was beginning the genocide, which is one of the most traumatic moments in Africa in the 20th century. So this is a very key month in Africa's history. The euphoria of democracy in South Africa and Rwanda entering a awful period with consequences that are still felt today. But I'd like to hear more about what was happening in South Africa and what tools were used to transition to peace and democracy, and what role do storytellers and filmmakers have in this process. Hello.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for your interest in this discussion. So I'll start with Salim's big question, and I hope I can do it some justice. As Salim mentioned, in 1994, our country marked a big break from its apartheid past, which was based on racial segregation and racial hierarchies in every facet of life. So when 1994 came, the years leading up to it was a democratic transition, and there was a negotiation process, and then, as Salim mentioned, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where all South Africans got to see live on television for most evenings people who would come forward to give testimony about what had happened in the past, in the apartheid past, but this was around grave human rights abuses that had taken. So it wasn't every transgression and that had happened, but it was very much the grave human rights violations that had happened. And as it is, and I think one of the reasons why we all here is because we believe in the power of storytelling and cinema. And I think generally, I mean, cinema in South Africa, as in many parts of the world, and specifically in a place which has to make a break and try to reckon with its past, I think cinema has been used as a tool to probe the past, to also in the current, in the everyday, to interpret the current times, and then of course to dream of the futures. So I think Salim, I think you said, you asked about storytelling and the kinds of storytelling that accompanied our historical transition and then coming into the present. I think if you look at South Africa, the first films that came out after 1994, when democracy came, were very much modeled, were very much mimicking the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a sense. So here for the first time, because let me just paint a picture, before 1994, we had television was banned in South Africa until 1976 because it would lead to evil things happening where people would get ideas about what the world should be like and would get ideas about justice. So TV was seen as a form of potentially rebellious. So when TV did come to South Africa during apartheid, it was propaganda programs. Black people, and there's a range of black people in South Africa, dark-skinned black people, did not have access to make films to be shown, and lots of the programs were just about lifestyle. 1994 came, there was a change in thinking. Culture and stories were seen as a right. There should be access to culture for everybody, and the state should play a role in seeing that more people could watch programs, could watch films towards nation building. And a lot of the films in the first period, especially the documentaries, they very much looked at the past. For the first time, filmmakers could probe into the past, try to really reveal what had happened during apartheid. So how had people suffered who had been tortured, who had been jailed, who had lost their lives? Also accountability. There were security forces who were operating in very underhand ways, assassinating people. So it was very much the films that came out were looking at the past. There was also an attempt, because black people did not have the chance to make programs, our state broadcaster went on, had some initiatives. They had some initiatives to give cameras to people who lived in, they called it ghetto stories. So what is life like there? They also gave a slot on television called Ordinary People, for ordinary people to follow, cameras followed ordinary people's lives, filmmakers followed ordinary people's lives, and ordinary people could talk about their experience of living in a transitional society. So those were the first films that came about. But as the years began to move on, the nature of storytelling also changed. So, for example, time passed since 1994, and the stories, especially documentaries which were interpreting the current, started not to look at the past so much, but really the effects of apartheid on children of the struggle. So there were some films about children of struggle heroes. There were also films about what happened to these activists and to these big freedom fighters. You know, what were their lives like? Were the promises of democracy and freedom being honored in their lives? So those kinds of films were being made. And then, I won't take up too much time, I'll move on to sort of the next era of filmmaking, which I think we're currently in, and that has been going on for the last 10 years. And I think it's led to a very diverse kind of storytelling, both in aesthetics, but also in the kind of stories that were told. And I think it's very much, as apartheid ended, as we became a mature democracy, we saw how messy post-apartheid and post-conflict societies are. So there suddenly wasn't this great picture of everybody reconciling and people having economic freedom and economic development. There was still a lot of racism, there was still a lot of structural inequalities, there was often no clear enemy, there's class divisions within race groups, there's also the politicians who we thought were entrusted to make things better are not operating in ways that seem to be the case. So the films that came out now were about filmmakers saying, we want to just tell stories, like what is South Africa? What is this South Africa? How do we understand it? So it stopped looking so much at the past, but it started to look at more, what is this country in terms of nationhood, politics, identity, and pretty much from the point of view of individuals. So, and this kind of added another layer, so through like essay documentaries and also through sort of longer observational documentaries or deeper interview films, people started to make comments about life as with all the messiness, with all the contradictions. So that's the kind of cinema. In addition, I'll just make the last point. There was also, I mean, maybe what you can call, some call it apartheid fatigue. So people didn't want to, especially the new generation, didn't want to look at stories or that were so purely located historically, but they wanted other ways of speaking about the current and also about the past. So other kind of genres where looking at stories about current society, but through westerns or through horror stories or just other forms of telling stories. So conclusion is that we need more stories, we need more storytellers, and there's so many parts of a country that we are still trying to learn. We're still trying to understand ourselves through making films, through watching films. We're trying to understand divisions, we're trying to understand similarities, and each film and each work of art and each political or social commentary helps to create a space for us to engage. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Ahora yo le voy a repetir la misma pregunta a Shenge para que explique cómo.
I'm now going to repeat the same question to Shenge. Tell me about telling stories in Rwanda and what importance does it have when it comes to healing after this genocide where 800,000 people died in 3 months' time in 1994. But additionally, there is a strategy that the country has used for peace building. Just as in South Africa there was the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, the commission that Colombia's Commission of Truth was inspired on. In Rwanda, there is a case of traditional justice that I'd like to ask Shenge to also explain to us how it operated, which are the courts that go by the name Gacaca.
My name is Ndimbira Shenge. I'm a filmmaker from Rwanda. So, as he said, in 1994, April 1994, it was on the 7th, that's when the genocide started, the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. It's actually like over 1 million people who were killed in 100 days. So it was like fast and it was cruel. The way it happened, it's not like people who went to kill others came from other districts or far. So in some cases, in many cases, it was like neighbors who came to kill, like neighbors. Some family members, like there were fathers who killed their own children. There were like husbands who killed their own like wives. So it was really terrible. So after the genocide, the country was destroyed in so many different ways, and so many people were traumatized, and people who committed the genocide had to go to trial for justice. So what happened? Rwanda couldn't use like the, how is it called? Yeah, like the court system couldn't like resolve all those cases. So they used Gacaca. Gacaca is it's a community-based trial that used to be used in the old times, where like the trusted citizens are given like the power to make some trials. So I think there were like 12,000 courts in the whole country, and in the end they managed to do I think 1,200,000 cases. So it helped a lot because like it had to be done as soon as possible so that the country move on, and it helped a lot like to rebuild the country, but also to unite unite citizens. Before the colonial time, Rwandans were one. Like it, the colonizers are the ones who started everything, who brought hate in our country. Because like before Rwanda was, we were all one people. We speak one language. It's not like you speak many languages. It's like everywhere you go in Rwanda, you can be able like to, you see someone, he's my brother, she's my sister. It was like that. But then after, I don't know how it turned, and people became like monsters in a blink of an eye. So, so now I move on to how arts helped. Every year in April, starting from the 7th to the 14th, we commemorate. And artists are the people who help a lot. People are going through trauma, through music, through films. So many films have been made about the topic, and it helped a lot because it helped people to see what happened, like the truth, and also how to move on after such a thing. There is one story that I want to share with you about the students of a school called Nyanje. In 1996, the people who committed the genocide who were in DRC were trying to come in the country again to kill and to terrorize people again because they didn't accept the defeat. So they went to that school at night, and they started to tell the students to separate themselves. They wanted some to go on this side and others to go on another side. But the students said no. So they started to kill them one by one, like in using guns, using like machetes, using like yeah. And they killed the first. They said, no, we are all Rwandans. The second one, no, we are all Rwandans. I think they killed 5 in 2 classes, but all students said we are all Rwandans. The reason why I wanted to share this story is to share with you like another way that Rwandans could manage to move on and also develop. It's they remembered who they were before. They remembered that they are one, that it's the only way to win. There is another story of like ants. I'm using stories. I don't know why it's better for me to explain things. Like when you put ants in a jar, like red ants and black ants, you just put them there, like they are going to continue its businesses, if I may say it like that. But if you take a jar and you shake it, the black ants are going to start to attack the red ones. Thinking that one is going to think it's because of the other. So this is what happened in Rwanda actually. But after we managed like to realize that we are one, that the only way to move forward is to live in peace, to love each other, and to become brothers and sisters again. So I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Y ahora, Jessica, si tú nos pudieras dar las perspectivas de Colombia.
Jessica, could you please share with us your take on Colombia's situation? Given that it's been a matter of human rights since before the peace process and even now in this process that we're experiencing, but you've also been involved in creating documentaries on the topic of victims. So apart from working on the topic of human rights, you also have a lot of experience narrating and sharing stories. Thank you very much, Salim. And thank you very much, DW Academy, for organizing this important South-South exchange to get to know these experiences that nourish us. They are painful experiences. They hurt us in our souls, but it also allows us to find these new ways to tell these stories. As in the documentary that we saw, to be able to lend your voice, lend me your voice. I believe this is very, very important. And I believe that's the great challenge we face in Colombia. First, to find ways for everyone to be lending their voices. First, lending their voices for this report on the commission, the Truth Commission. Here in Colombia, we also just finished receiving this report, and it's called Hay futuro si hay verdad. There is a future if there is truth. And the challenge is to share what has happened and what continues to happen. Because in our country, even though, well, we already have the report on clarifying truth, but we continue with internal conflict. There continues to be many victims. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about this report to be able to tell you about what we do at our collective of lawyers. First of all, it's important to remember that this report said that in Colombia, for example, there were 4,300 massacres. And when we speak of figures, it's very difficult because we're saying 4,300 some massacres, and sometimes that figure doesn't tell us very much. It's not telling to many of us. It doesn't tell us who those people were, how many people were murdered and massacred in front of their families, how many children saw how their parents were killed, their relatives were killed in various municipalities and places in the country. But this report also tells us that in Colombia, more than 210,000 people have been forcefully displaced in Colombia. These are men and women that have disappeared in the women. So this means that there are many families surrounding them, especially women, looking for their children, their sons, their daughters, their husbands, and they don't know where they are. And when one begins to speak and represent these victims of forced disappearance, every day that passes is torture to them, because every day the family is imagining that their relative is being tortured, that they are going hungry, if it's a woman or a daughter, that they are being raped, and not having their family member near them is not knowing what's happening and not being able to mourn them correctly. So these figures are overwhelming for us. Genocide against a political party. Here, the Unión Patriótica party was exterminated. Thousands of people were killed just because they belonged to a political party, the Unión Patriótica. So when we see these alarming figures, the great challenge oftentimes as lawyers is how we're going to tell the world about what's happening in our country, what the relatives are feeling and suffering through from a different perspective, because sometimes films have been told and novels have been told from the position of the perpetrator. The one we see on TV is the perpetrator. There are series and TV programs that show the side of the perpetrators, but we're not seeing the victims, to begin to see the faces of these figures that sometimes are very faceless. Sometimes we have the challenge of showing these cases of forced disappearance. Who disappeared? Why was that person disappeared? What did that person do? And it's very important for us to begin to see those faces and those individuals behind those figures. And that's where film plays a very important role, because it has other ways to tell these stories. But telling the stories not only from the position of the victims, but also the causes for the conflict that are oftentimes not reported in this country. So the inequality that continues to exist in Colombia, racism, because this is a country where we also suffer with racism, the patriarchy that continues to exist in Colombia. And oftentimes this is not told in these great stories that are shared. For example, we're also not sharing the extractivistic economic model that also leads to many political and economic conflict in Colombia. So that's the challenge we face. It's also a country where there's a great deal of impunity. Although we have the court and trials and the constitutional court, which is an important court, it's a country where impunity thrives. This is why we feel very honored to be a part of this event, to share from your experience. We've always looked up to South Africa and Rwanda for the experience that you've had there, to look for ways or solutions for non-repetition. And at this film festival, I hope producers and directors and those who believe in this beautiful art also commit to showing these other stories and situations that we need to know in order to not repeat them, to know what has happened, and that perhaps in what we can't allow as new generations, we can't allow that this occur again, so that we can truly overcome this armed conflict in Colombia. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jessica. I wanted to continue with Usman, speaking from a different part in the world, from Western Africa. At least, so Usman is from Mali and Ivory Coast. And his documentary that you'll be able to see tomorrow at the Centenary Park, The Last Shelter, speaks about the refugees or the migrants that are looking for ways to get to Europe going through the Sahara Desert. But it's in this area, Sahel in the Sahara, that an inverse process occurred. Inverse to what we'd seen in other cases. So instead of a period of instability, it's a transition toward stability. In Western Africa, it's been somewhat the opposite. For decades, this is a region that enjoyed political and financial stability to a certain degree, up until in the last 10 years, once Gaddafi was overthrown. I will not enter into the details of the consequence of this process, but the Sahel region entered a period of instability, and as we know, there are many fundamentalist groups and groups that are trafficking persons, illegally trafficking cocaine in the Sahara, etc. So this entire region becomes a very violent, complicated area, but it's also a region that is known for the griots, these storytellers and musicians, jugglers, that not only sing but also play a very important role in society, which is conflict resolution. So with this context, I wanted to ask Usman to speak. He's somewhat of a contemporary griot or storyteller today, to know more about how the artists of Sahel and Western Africa contributing to help to go beyond the social fractures that exist today. Thank you very much, Salim, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak, and thank you to the other panelists. I'm afraid there's a lot of interference coming in through my ears, so I hope to be able to speak. It's quite complex to speak of the crisis in Sahel because we're speaking of 5 countries in this area of the Sahara. This band that is located, we have Mali, Burkina Faso, among other countries. And this band is not easy to control. In the year 2012, after a crisis that occurred in Mali, many problems arose. This is a region that we feel like no nation can control it. There's so much traffic occurring here, as Salim said. Weapons traffic, persons traffic, drugs traffic, and so much illegal trade occurring among these countries. Currently, the difference is that we are fortunate enough to have people get together to be able to stand up to these terrorists, because beyond the terrorist activities, there are many other things that occur in this region. And as filmmakers and artists, as documentary makers especially, I believe we play a very important role. Salim said this earlier, and there's a quote I really like, is that We are the storytellers, or a contemporary griot, someone who dares to tell the truth to the king, to the chief, without being afraid of any consequences. And that's what gives us the strength. Some of these countries in Africa have maintained this tradition. But this is a very complicated political context. It's not easy to tell the truth to the heads of state because we are all afraid of the consequences. But this tradition allows us as griots to continue to do so and do so. So as a documentary maker, if I stand in this position that Salim has just put me in, well, what role will we have as contemporary griots? What can we do to say or to share the truth to these collectives and leaders, as well as to expose what is occurring in our countries, specifically in this region of the world? Here now, you'll see the movie tomorrow. It's a film that speaks of migration, specifically a story that takes place in this portion of the Sahara between Algeria and Mali. And I wanted to go there and understand how this area operates and how these migrants that want to go beyond the desert, how they cross this region, and those that return. What story do they have to share with us when they return? So I believe it's very important for us as filmmakers, and above all, as documentary makers, to dare to expose this, to discuss topics that are taboo, in quotes, in Africa. I'm sorry, I have a hard time pronouncing your new name. But many of these films that discuss these social problems, problems that were discussed by filmmakers and documentary makers from other parts of the world that came to Africa and shot in Africa, with their perspective, their eye as foreigners. They came to film us as insects. They were filming us from above and we were here below at the bottom. And for a long time, Africa was filmed from this gaze. An Africa going hungry, an Africa at war, an Africa in poverty. So this didn't work. But on the other hand, it's true that there are many things that are not good in Africa. But on the other hand, we have the good that was never shown. And this is the power behind this new generation of filmmakers and documentary makers that dare to take the destiny of our future in their hands and tell it with truth and the way it should be told. That is a responsibility we have. It's a responsibility our generation has, those of us who have experienced this moment, this key moment in film. We can choose if to do our work well or betray this responsibility that we have received. Our mission is to tell our story in truth and show Africa with beauty and dignity. I believe I should not limit myself just to this and limit myself to speak to, when there's good, there's also bad, but the bad doesn't damage the good, so it's a combination that we need to work with. Some things don't work, but we also need to dare to say it. Politics, there's a lot of hunger. We know that that's true, but we are the ones that need to be telling the story and not others, not the ones that we're used to seeing on TV and through journalists. That needs to come from us. We know migration is dangerous and that there are many deaths that occur during this process of migration, as well as many people that are trafficked. But it's also our responsibility as young filmmakers and documentary makers to share this story from our point of view and not the way we're accustomed to see this or the way we are usually portrayed. Thousands of migrants that die through clandestine migration, that die in the sea miserably with no dignity. I believe this is something we need to feel we need to appropriate our own story and our own perspective. We're lucky enough to have a new and beautiful generation of filmmakers and documentary makers that dare and are brave enough to tell these stories so that we can make progress. And above all, for us to be able to leave this legacy to those who will follow after us. And for this story, this fight for Africa to continue to exist. Thank you very much. Well, and what Usman has mentioned, which is sharing our own stories, and without the mediation of Europe and the global north, is precisely why we believe it's important to have these South-South dialogues in a more horizontal way, a less vertical approach. I'm afraid we have not reached that point yet, and even these spaces, which are very scarce, occur through the mediation of the global north. This is something we must mention. As they said in the era of independence, not yet Huru. In other words, we are not yet free. We are independent, but freedom is a path that, or something that we are still looking to achieve. So with this, I wanted to move on to Walter, who's also a contemporary griot from the Caribbean, Colombia's Caribbean, through his music. But he has a project with a social impact that has a significant impact. Vocaribe. Walter, we'd like to hear of Vocaribe's experience in peace building, as well as the importance of making certain communities visible, communities that are not used to having their social conditions and realities being shared or spoken of. Thank you, Salim. Thank you, Shamela, Shenge, Usmane, Jessica, Maria. Thank you all. I'd like to embrace you and thank you for being here. In order for this message to continue its course, as each and every one of you, I believe I'm very excited. To be also involves the need for taking a break, because in this connection that we have, it's important to make a ritual out of it. In fact, it is a ritual. And I'm going to allow myself to say a part of the response in song.
No me ayuda quien causa el dolor y luego viene a ver si me duele. No me ayuda quien causa el dolor y luego viene a ver si me duele. Que no me ayude, ay, que no me ayude. Quien inútilmente ha tratado de cambiar mi destino. Que no me ayude, ay, que no me ayude. Quien inútilmente ha tratado de cambiar mi destino. 1000 balas juntas no serán suficientes para arrebatarnos las ganas de vivir. 1000 balas juntas no serán suficientes para arrebatarnos las ganas de vivir. Vida, ay vida, ay vida, 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 ay vida, ay vida, vida, vida. Así respiramos.
That is how we breathe. Vocaribe Radio, as its name describes, stands for Voices of the Caribbean. And this in itself is a great challenge. And this is just the mission. To have our own radio. For you to have your own radio. For me to not be speaking in your stead, for you. But instead for us to support each other, to find ways to do so. Because there's not a written formula to achieve this. Vocaribe came about in 1991, where we dared to imagine a new way to do things, a peace process that I've now analyzed in 2023 to see how we feel. When you describe it, when you say all of these realities, these adversities, this violence that has occurred and that continue taking place. So we have been in this experience for doing this for more than 20 years. Exploring ways to ensure that the voices of Caribbeans matter. For them to tell their stories to themselves, to tell their stories to other Caribbeans, to tell these stories of what is taking place here. So, geographically speaking, we're referring to half of the city of Barranquilla, southwest, 800,000 people, that are part of this territory because it's there that they found an opportunity after having to flee from the violence that has already been mentioned, flee from Montes de Maria. The entire African diaspora that is currently a urban palenque located in the neighborhoods of Nueva Colombia, Manga, Niquejo, and a part in Barrio Abajo. So here we're referring to people who had already experienced what it meant to be displaced by violence. And that is the territory where we had to reconfigure life, to do everything again, and make it possible in this new territory to find new ways to express what is being done. So Vocaribe came about as a proposal among friends and a process of community and student leadership. For example, in my case, I was born in Turbaco, Bolívar, close from here, in the ancestral community of Yurbaco. This is a place that still doesn't have a sewage system or a water distribution system that's very precarious. And it's here very close to the marvelous fluidity of the Yuma River, the Magdalena, through the Canal del Dique. And yet it still doesn't have drinking water. Treated water, yes. Treated water, yes. Potable water, no. In Barranquilla, the same thing occurs. So there's a word that I love using in the situation of resistance, which is that we're not living in cities like this. We're living in Ruropolis. We have the memories of our ancestors from Africa and our ancestors from all the various migrations that have arrived and that are a part of us. And it's with that that we have put together the life we have today. What Vocaribe does is present formats and present resistance to the government, because when in the 90s we decided to have these voices be heard, there was not a law that recognized this kind of radio. This kind of radio has various names: free radios, alternative radios, citizen radios, and all these names that you might want to give it. But what we are clear on is that we didn't want to, nor do we feel reflected in the commercial radio, because that was a radio where we were not heard. We made music, but they wouldn't pay attention to us in that radio. There, the rural peoples were just figures, given the displacement. And I'd like to connect to a quote by Alfonso Ganciali, a Palenco researcher, who said that in the report, when they spoke of the impact to the Palenque and Rizal populations, he said that those who are violent and all the organizations that have been carrying out violent activities to displace people from their territories, and even going back from the days of colonization and slavery, what they saw were pantry areas for them to procure what they needed. They wouldn't see people, they wouldn't see their flavor, their food, their culture, their forms of interaction. No, all they would see were machines for production to obtain what they needed. And this city in Cartagena, I'm quoting what he said. This is what he said, and it had an impact on me, because at Vocaribe, what we do is that I'm not going to be the radio. We're going to do it together, and we're going to learn how to do it together. That's the process. I'll give you some examples. 90 minutes of radio on the street. There's a table set, the mics are set, and there's a pre-production of what's occurring in the area. And at the SENA, which is a National Learning Service, it's placed for all these stories to be heard. If someone wants to tell a story, he can tell a story. If someone wants to dance, he can dance, etc. But we've also learned that that which is community-based is a dimension where there are power struggles. Governments do not want to understand that that which is community is not just a plot. They limited us. First, there was no legal recognition. Once there was legal recognition, they began to give it to municipalities in rural areas. But when it came to capital cities, it took nearly 20 years for there to finally be a bid that recognized the capital cities as well as a right to communication. In theory, that's the case, but when it comes to practice, those of us who are in cities have limitations. Why? Well, the answer is clear. They don't want our voices to go any further. But on the one hand, we have this discourse of the globalization and internet and connectivity, but a community news station can only have 50 watts. Most people that live in the southwest of Barranquilla work in other neighborhoods. If they want to hear the radio, they're following the radio, and then they lose the signal after some time, given this limitation when it comes to the wattage and the signal. Evidence shows that connectivity and the internet is the solution in digital. That's what people say. But I don't want to take up too much time. So what we have learned is that 10 years have gone by since we were given the license to explore different formats and learn to teach and do radio. This involves not only using these devices, it also involves media convergence and cross-media today, as well as a process of learning. We learned that it's not enough to merely, what we say is that what's the point of radio today if anyone has a mobile phone and they can send information and stream? information? I leave you with that question as well. We continue finding answers, or looking for answers. After 10 years of having a license, we made the decision of requesting an extension, and it was granted. So now we have another 10 years ahead of us to continue learning how to do community radio. Formats, we look for people that have disappeared in the Cauca River. This is a project with the organization Rutas del Conflicto, where women are certainly those who are looking for those who have disappeared. And these are sound documentaries that go beyond the platforms. They transcend the platforms because they become partnerships between people of flesh and blood that begin to support each other. In closing, I'd like to say that Vocaribe and its programming, its proposal, is the Afro-Caribbean universe. The music from Mali, South Africa, Rwanda, and the whole of Africa, ideally, are heard on Vocaribe every day. But there is a process that continues to require more work, and it's to continue strengthening education, which, when we refer to formal education, is far from what is needed to be able to recognize ourselves with all of our complexities. This is needed for upcoming generations, and this is something we continue to insist on at Vocaribe. Thank you. Thank you, Walter. I believe we could continue speaking with each of our panelists for hours, but we just wanted to leave some time for questions or comments from the audience. But I'm going to take advantage of the presence in the audience of an expert in impact productions from South Africa, Sarah Summer, who is currently in the audience. And the question follows logically from these comments from the various panelists. We're telling these stories, but now what? If we want there to be a social impact, how can we make this happen? What good is it to tell these stories? How can we actually bring about change? So it's along these lines that we would like to ask Sarah. Could you please give her a mic? Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Sarah Summers. I am an impact coordinator from South Africa, working with the Generation Africa collection. And so the three filmmakers on the stage from South Africa are part of that collection. And as you can tell from the discussion, the context and regions are really, really different. So one of the first kind of important things that we think about when considering impact just on the continent is getting people in Africa to have access to the films. And so there's a platform called AfriDocs where we stream the films for free to African audiences. And maybe just to give you a little bit more context, as a South African, I don't really I wasn't taught about the experiences of African people in different countries. So there was a lot of knowledge on stage today that was new to even me. And so that's why it's important for us to be able to just connect to the work within the region. And then also taking the films into communities where they come from. And so we do community screenings and facilitated discussions at these screenings so that audiences have an opportunity to reflect on experiences that they've seen, that they may identify with, that they may struggle against contexts, and then as a collective kind of work through that in conversation at screenings, and then maybe also start to plant ideas about how to take action. And there can be different kinds of community screenings. Sometimes a community screening can be with policymakers or environmental activists. So community, it's, very broad understanding of the word community. And then also partnering with organizations and civil society and institutions that are working on the issues that are present in the film, so that the film becomes a tool that they can then use for work that they're already invested in. And then also just mobile cinema units that are taking the films across Africa. Thank you.
Gracias, Sara. Y aprovechando unos minutos entonces.
Thank you, Sarah. Just to make the most of the time that remains, if the audience has any questions or comments, I believe there is someone that would like to speak at the end of the patio. Is there a mic available for questions from the audience?
Este.
Hola, buenas tardes. Pues un gusto.
Hello and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to hear you. I am a documentary maker and researcher. I'm currently working on documentaries that have been made in Colombia as a legal ruling for reparation. I understand that there are a variety of experiences and other films have been done on this topic. I understand that in South Africa, films have been done as part of a reparation ruling. In other words, the state is sentenced to carry out a series of exercises to establish rights, and as part of the symbolic restoration, a film must be made. In Colombia, what's happened is that some communities have demanded documentaries as part of a process of symbolic restoration. I'd like to know if you could share some of these experiences with us that are of a similar nature, if you've put together films, and how much this has aided in the process of reparation, and what reflections you have on this. And I don't know if in Colombia, I believe it's also worth reflecting on this exercise of using documentaries as a form of reparation. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. What's interesting in documentaries when compared to fiction is the way that documentaries can really have an impact on society and on communities when discussing a specific topic. I believe there are many documentaries that allow us to have debates that didn't exist in the past or discussions we didn't dare to have because they discuss so many different realities, and this can allow people to look at themselves in the mirror, that mirror that where they look at themselves every day and say that perhaps there's something there that's right, something that's not right, this must be done, or that other thing must be done. I believe that when referring to film, it's just documentaries that can truly advance this. There are also therapeutic documentaries, not only for communities but also for the person behind the making of the documentary. Yesterday we watched a very interesting DEUTCHE WELLE. It's a documentary that speaks of sexual violence and rape, and the filmmaker filmed a young girl that was raped at 14 years of age. And it's through the story of this film that she chose to tell her own story, because when she was 5, she too was sexually abused, and she didn't dare to speak of this to her family because she felt that she was the guilty one, not the victim. So it was thanks to this documentary that she was able to not only go beyond this taboo of girls that are victims of this form of violence, but she was also in the shoes of, so she was able to address this problem. And by having this character in the film, she was also able to heal. It's a form of introspection that she experienced. So we need to dare to discuss these topics. And if we can discuss it through film and with others that have gone through the same thing, others will feel connected and say, if she dares to say this in front of everyone, then I too can do so, and I can share my own story. So this is just one example of many. A documentary can help us to find solutions. Many might feel that film is something transitory, but films truly can have an impact on the community. But beyond the film, we must find real solutions for the problems that a film addresses. And that's something documentaries can do.
Specifically about documentaries and South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This has been 25 years ago, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was running, there were certainly many documentaries that were mimicking what was happening in the Truth and Reconciliation. So taking facts of the report and testimonies of people who had come before the commission, and these testimonials were turned into documentaries where you could hear the experience of the family members of the person who had disappeared. And it was a way of a catharsis to a great deal, and healing, and also trying to find out what's happening. But I wanted to talk more about current times, because even 30 years later in South Africa, especially over the last few years, there has been more documentaries, a series of new documentaries coming out about things that should have been investigated in the 1990s that weren't. So people who died in detention, and the government then had said they'd slipped and fallen or committed suicide, but the families have always known that this wasn't the case, and they were killed by the then government. So in recent years, in fact, a filmmaker in South Africa made a film about an inquest that should happen to a South African who was murdered during apartheid, and he looked at a story about how the inquest that did happen was a fake inquest, and found, told lies about him, and didn't really investigate the truth. And once this documentary was made, people began to talk about it, and this made a huge change in the appetite to actually go into the past through legal means and to prosecute more cases of officials back then who actually killed people, but there was a cover-up. So at the moment, there is another case being opened up through the legal courts, which are going to look into more cases of lack of accountability. So I think these kinds of films definitely have the power to look into, to reopen investigations, and to even if they reopen painful episodes, it's towards getting some kind of truth and justice. So that, I think it's an important part. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. With regard to these documentaries, well, in Colombia, as a means of reparation, the Comprehensive Right to Reparation has ordered the creation of documentaries, and this is thanks to rulings from the Inter-American Court. Nonetheless, the challenge, and now that Sarah was speaking of impact, so the question in Colombia is what impact has been achieved through these documentaries that have been made? For example, I'd like to ask those who are present, who of you has seen a documentary as a result of a ruling, whether it be the Council of State or the Inter-American Court? I believe perhaps it's very few of you. If I would ask you to raise your hand, I don't know if maybe 1 or 2 people would raise their hands, because that's the challenge we face. I believe many of the attendees didn't even know that this is a ruling that is made as a form of reparation in Colombia. So this is, justice is an important step forward, but we are seeing that it's not achieving the social impact desired in communities for their reparation, because what are we looking for when a person, family, or community is asking for a measure of reparation to be to create a documentary? It's for many people to know their story, for them to know what happened and why it happened. And this is not occurring for a variety of reasons, but I'd just like to give you an example of what happened in the Manuel Cepeda case. Manuel Cepeda, who led the Unión Patriótica party. One of the reparation measures for his death was to make a documentary. First, there was an entire negotiation for his relatives to be able to choose who was going to be the director for this documentary, because the minimum right should be to be able to choose who will be the director and the producers of the documentary, and not for the state to impose this on the victims. And then when the documentary was going to be released, they didn't do it at the time that was agreed, but instead it was screened by Señal Colombia at 11 p.m. So at that time, no one was going to watch it. It was going to be very difficult for them to achieve their goal of it being circulated and seen. So I believe we face a big challenge there, but it continues to be a window of opportunity. I see it as a window of opportunity, even in the world of film, with the producers that they work on film with and documentaries. And the way every day we see that there is more convergence with the communities that have been re-victimized, for them to understand that it's a form of reparation, but also even in the government sector, for them to understand how this measure can be used for reparation. So it's telling the stories that the victims need to be told, sharing the truth, and above all, for it to achieve that impact, for the society to know of these cases. I believe we have 3 minutes left. If these two comments are very brief, then we can receive them. Thank you, Wilfried. Go ahead. Good afternoon. I'm Wilfried Masamba. I'll be speaking in French. I'm from Congo, and I've been in Colombia for 20 years. And the question is that we're here at the heart of this festival. Welcome to Cartagena. It's the first time you're here. So what have you discovered during your stay here? Have you been able to take advantage during this festival to meet with Afro-Colombian directors here? Have you had a chance to speak to them? Because it's very important for you to have this exchange between Colombia and Africa. As filmmaker and directors from Africa and those that are from the African diaspora here, for you to be able to get to know each other. Because we have this idea of Africa. We would like to know who the filmmakers from Africa are, what they want to show and share with us. Have you had an opportunity to have this exchange during the festival? Thank you very much for that question. It's a very pertinent question, because I believe that to be able to advance quickly, the answer would be no. We have not had the time to do so. There has not been much time, and with the festival's agenda, we did not have this scheduled in to be able to have these kinds of exchanges with other directors. I'll be able to meet with you tonight, but it's wonderful to be able to have these opportunities to meet parallel to the other activities. It's going to allow for this exchange to be much more productive and for us all to be able to discuss many different topics. But unfortunately, so far I have not been able to have those kinds of exchanges, and we hope for that to be the case in the future. I'm afraid our time is up, but we don't want to leave without first inviting you to the screening at 6:40 in exactly 40 meetings. We're going to see the documentary African Moot, directed by Shamila Seda, and we'll have a Q&A between Shamila and Jessica after the screening. They've both been a part in putting together this documentary that speaks of youth, Pan-Africanism, human rights, and all the other topics we've discussed here today. So without that, thank you very much, and many thanks to our panelists.